Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life. Knowles tries to deflect, claiming it was merely an exercise of free speech. But just minutes later, Jasmine reveals undeniable evidence. The chamber freezes instantly. Knowles is left speechless, cornered by the very words he thought no one would ever hear, and his career teeters on the edge of collapse. What did Jasmine expose? And how did it bring one of the loudest voices in conservative media to his knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The ballroom at the 2023 Conservative Political Action Conference was packed wall to wall. The air was sharp with tension, cameras rolling from every angle, as Michael Knowles stood under the blazing stage lights. Then he said it. Cold, unapologetic. Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. No metaphor, no nuance. Just a statement so direct, it cracked through the conference like a gunshot. At first there was silence, then came applause from some, but by the time the footage hit Twitter, the rest of the country was already on fire. LGBTQ+ advocates, civil rights groups, and even international organizations were calling it what it was: a public call to erase human identity under the mask of ideology. By the next morning, the White House press secretary called the statement dangerous hate speech that belongs in history books, not primetime TV. Protests erupted in more than a dozen cities. Civil rights attorneys condemned it. LGBTQ+ youth hotlines reported a spike in crisis calls. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was damage, quantifiable and immediate. But instead of retracting, Knowles doubled down on national radio. If they're offended, good. Maybe they'll finally shut up. That was the tipping point. A line had been crossed, and Congress wasn't going to let it pass quietly. 3 days later, a formal inquiry was announced. The title of the hearing was blunt: Public Speech and Social Harm, the line between liberty and threat. It wasn't just a media event, it was political theater with real consequences. Witnesses were called, subpoenas were issued, and when the panel needed a voice that could cut through legal ambiguity and moral gray zones alike, they didn't hesitate. Jasmine Crockett's name was inked in bold. Not just as a congresswoman, not just as a civil rights lawyer, but as the lead special counsel and primary challenger to Michael Knowles. Because this wasn't going to be a polite exchange, this was war. And Jasmine? She didn't come to whisper. The match had a name, and now the whole country was waiting to see which side would burn first. Michael Knowles didn't wait for the cameras to find him. He walked straight into their center. Hair combed to deflect judgment, tie chosen for subtle defiance. He stood behind a podium outside the Capitol and delivered his line with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed every syllable in front of a mirror. "They're not angry because I lied," he said, voice calm and cutting. "They're angry because I dared to say what everyone else thinks, but no one dares to say." His team stood behind him, arms folded, nodding like a Greek chorus of smug certainty. The crowd roared, divided in its reasons. On one side, applause. On the other, screams. Journalists fired questions. Knowles answered none. He adjusted his cufflink, stepped back, and let the chaos do the speaking for him. Washington became a fortress overnight. The Capitol grounds, once open to school tours and tourist buses, now stood cordoned off with concrete barriers and metal barricades. Helicopters traced circles in the sky, low and relentless. Protesters from both ends of the spectrum, furious liberals, militant traditionalists, flooded Pennsylvania Avenue. Rainbow flags and Gadsden banners clashed in the same breath. Federal police patrolled with helmets on and visors down. It wasn't just security, it was expectation. Tension moved like static through the streets, unpredictable and wild. Because for the first time in years, the nation wasn't divided by policy, but by the raw nerve of who gets to exist and who decides that answer. And then she appeared. No red carpet, no press release, just the sound of stilettos cracking against stone and the slow turning of heads. Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She moved through the security gates like a blade through paper, clean, silent, unstoppable. In her left hand was a leather-bound file, thick with evidence and sealed with a single red tab. In her right, a small black flash drive, no label, no logo, just quiet promise. The officers at the gate stepped aside instinctively, sensing this wasn't a politician entering. This was a reckoning. And inside that flash drive, a clip no one had ever seen. Not the networks, not the legal teams, not even Knowles. And it wasn't just a recording, it was a fuse. The silence wasn't passive. It had weight. The kind of silence that falls when everyone knows something is coming, but no one knows how hard it will land. She didn't change her posture. She didn't soften or dramatize. She simply let the moment mature until the stillness became suffocating, then pierced it with clarity. "Mr. Knowles," she said, her voice cool, composed, almost surgical, "tell me, between these two statements, which one do you believe is more protected under the Constitution? Transgenderism must be eradicated, or Judaism must be eradicated? No spin, just the plain words. Which is more acceptable to say out loud in public under our laws?" She wasn't baiting him. She was drawing a boundary, one that millions of Americans had never been privileged enough to name, let alone enforce. And she was doing it under oath, in front of cameras, in front of the very machine that often erased nuance under the weight of partisanship. Around her, you could feel the room stall. Eyebrows lifted. Phones stopped recording just long enough for hands to freeze mid-text. It wasn't outrage yet. It was anticipation, the kind that comes right before either redemption or collapse. Knowles hesitated. For the first time that day, the foundation of his confidence cracked. Not publicly, not theatrically, but inwardly. His fingers curled slightly and his shoulders shifted in the chair. You could see him calculating, looking for the exit within the question, but there wasn't one. Just the truth staring back at him. I was referring to an ideology," he said slowly, "not a group of people." His voice was strained, the delivery mechanical. A line he had used before, a line that had worked before, but not here, not now. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't scoff. She responded the way people do when they've heard something not just wrong, but deeply, dangerously familiar. She lowered her voice, not in volume, but in pitch, grounding it with weight. "Ideologies don't bleed," she said. "Ideologies don't vanish. They don't disappear on their own. They die when people die, when real, breathing people are erased under the excuse of destroying a belief." She let that sentence land before continuing, slower, heavier. "So let's not pretend this is academic, because the impact never is." Her voice wasn't angry, it was precise. And that precision cut deeper than rage ever could. The room reacted not with shouts, but with breathlessness. Even those who disagreed with her visibly tensed. The mask of policy had just been pulled off, revealing something far older and far more dangerous underneath. That was the moment the hearing stopped being procedural and started being personal. Then Jasmine opened her binder and retrieved a single document, highlighted in orange. She didn't have to raise it. She just began to read. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, calls to eradicate an identity, whether racial, religious, or gender-based, are not political theory. They're the kind of rhetoric that leads to real-world violence. This is not scholarship. This is a threat. The room was dead quiet, not out of agreement or outrage, but recognition. They had heard this rhythm before, in history books, in archived footage, in the silent testimonies of those who never got to speak again. Knowles shifted. Someone on his team reached for a pen but never wrote. Jasmine's voice cut again, not louder but final. "You don't get to strip humanity down to language and walk away clean." And that was it. She hadn't attacked him. She hadn't humiliated him. She had done something far worse in a courtroom like this. She had made the lie impossible to ignore. In that moment, it wasn't just Michael Knowles being questioned. It was every person who had ever reduced identity to theory. Every lawmaker who had nodded silently while others spoke like this. Every viewer watching who had once thought, maybe it's just a point of view. Jasmine Crockett had drawn the line between ideas and people, and shown the country what it costs when we pretend there's no difference. The room hadn't moved, but the energy had shifted, palpably, dangerously. Jasmine's final words still echoed in the collective conscience of everyone present. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't accused, but she had pierced through the polished facade of political theory and exposed something raw, something real. And Michael Knowles knew it. You could see it in the tension creeping up his neck, in the tightening of his jaw, in the sudden stiffness in his spine. Silence had never been his ally, and now it was cornering him. He leaned forward, no longer relaxed, no longer untouched by the weight of the hearing. His voice came out fast, firm, almost rehearsed, but laced with something new: agitation. "We have the right to disagree," he snapped, his eyes flicking between Jasmine and the cameras as though trying to decide who he was really speaking to. "They have the right to exist, absolutely, but I have the right to speak the truth." His knuckles tapped the wood twice, an unspoken challenge, a desperate attempt to reassert control. "This is still America," he said louder now, as if volume could restore the balance, "where we're allowed to think freely, even if the left doesn't like what we think." Then came the prop, thin paper held up like armor. A printed copy of the First Amendment, already creased at the edges from overuse. He waved it slightly, not high, but just enough for the cameras to catch. "You don't get to twist the Constitution because you're emotionally uncomfortable," he said, words sharper now, echoing through the marble like thrown knives. "The progressive left weaponizes feelings to silence facts. They use outrage like a club, not reason." His words accelerated, fast, heavy, urgent, like a man running ahead of something he knew was coming. "Discomfort is not violence. Dissent is not hate. What I said wasn't an attack. It was a viewpoint. And if that's outlawed, we're no longer a free society." But something in his delivery betrayed him. It wasn't just what he said. It was how tightly he clung to it. He wasn't speaking to the panel. He was speaking through it, to someone else, to a base he hoped was watching, to a world outside this chamber where applause didn't come with consequences. But inside, in this room, the temperature had changed. The eyes watching him now weren't just journalists or fellow lawmakers. They were survivors, scholars, students, sons and daughters of people who had heard similar defenses used as cover for violence. He didn't see Jasmine interrupt, because she didn't. She didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't blink. And that, more than any rebuttal, was the most dangerous response of all. Because when a woman like Jasmine Crockett goes quiet, she isn't retreating, she's measuring. And Michael Knowles, despite all his words, could feel it. His voice filled the room, but the gravity had already moved elsewhere. The chamber hadn't recovered from the last exchange, and Jasmine hadn't moved, not to celebrate, not to capitalize, not even to speak. She knew exactly what silence was worth, especially when the other side had filled the room with so much noise. Instead of responding with words, she simply lifted a small remote from the table and tapped it once. The screen behind her blinked to life. A clip began playing. No warning, no transition, just raw footage, time-stamped and uncut. "Greta Thunberg is a mentally ill Swedish child being exploited by adults." Knowles' voice rang out, flat and matter-of-fact, in a 2019 Fox News interview. No nuance, no analysis, just a grown man with a microphone speaking about a 16-year-old girl on international television. As the audio ended, Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She looked at Knowles. Not with contempt, not even with judgment, just clarity. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet enough to draw the room closer. "Mr. Knowles," she asked, "you call that academic debate?" Her words weren't rhetorical, they were surgical, meant to cut through the talking points and land in the soft tissue of intent. For a split second, Knowles didn't answer. You could almost see him recalculating, his posture stiffening, lips pursing. But then he leaned forward, his voice sharp and defensive. "I'm stating facts," he said, carefully enunciating every word. "That is my constitutional right." His hands pressed against the table now, knuckles whitening just slightly. "You're twisting it. You're pulling one sentence out of context to frame me as the villain, when in fact I was pointing out how political activists were manipulating a child to serve their agenda." He gestured to the air, to the gallery, to no one in particular. "The left loves turning feelings into weapons. And clearly, Congresswoman Crockett, you've mastered that art." There it was, the pivot, the deflection, The attempt to put her on trial for reacting instead of himself for speaking. Jasmine didn't flinch. She pressed the button again. The clip played a second time. Same line, same tone, only now slower. You could hear the weight of it more clearly. Greta Thunberg is a mentally ill Swedish child being exploited by adults. The words dropped like lead in the chamber. There was no laugh track, no pundit to cut to, just silence and that sentence. This time when the video stopped, Jasmine spoke without looking at him. Her eyes stayed on the panel. Her voice was calm but unmistakably sharper. "So," she said, "insulting a child on national television? That's what you consider scholarship?" It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. A line drawn not in politics but in principle. Knowles shifted uncomfortably. "What I said," he responded, "was a criticism of how political figures were using her. Not her. Not her personally. The adults behind her. That's what I meant." His tone was rushed now, uneven. Less conviction, more containment. He was answering, but he wasn't persuading. Not the room, not the cameras, and definitely not Jasmine Crockett. The energy shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but noticeably. One side of the room tried to clap, unsure. A few smirks flickered in the press section, but then came the laughter. Quick, scattered, bitter. A few gasps followed, and then quiet again. Not the respectful kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that follows a remark no one's sure how to defend. Jasmine stayed still. No smile, no head shake. Just her presence. And the quiet certainty of someone who knew the difference between free speech and reckless speech. She hadn't used outrage. She hadn't demanded apologies. All she had done was hold up his own words and ask the world if that looked like truth or cowardice in a suit. And in that moment, for all his constitutional citations and clever pivots, Michael Knowles looked less like a thought leader and more like a man trying to explain why punching down counted as courage. There was a flicker, barely a beat, between silence and collapse. Jasmine had laid the truth bare, and the chamber knew it. But not everyone was ready to let the mask fall. Especially not the man who had worn it so comfortably for years. The screen still glowed behind her. Harsh and clinical, it displayed the internal memo like a confession inked in daylight. This was a leaked internal email from the Daily Wire, a message sent from the network's editorial leadership, dated June 2022. "Push anti-trans angle hard this week. Don't shy away from saying what gets clicks. Controversy moves numbers. Don't be afraid to shock." The words weren't academic. They weren't rhetorical. They were transactional. The kind of language born not in debate halls but in conference rooms with quarterly goals. Suddenly, Knowles shot to his feet. The motion was abrupt, almost reflexive. "I didn't write that," he snapped, his voice slicing through the room like a panicked defense. "I don't control the marketing department. I don't make strategy calls. That email has nothing to do with me." His hands hovered midair, palms open, caught between denial and pleading. His eyes darted, not defiantly this time, but searching for an anchor, for sympathy, for distance. "I'm a commentator. I respond to the news. I don't shape what goes out from management," he added. But the words felt thinner now, like excuses rehearsed too many times to carry weight. Across the room, Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't rise. She didn't need to. The higher ground was already hers. "And yet," she said slowly, each word more deliberate than the last, "your segments follow that email like a checklist." She turned slightly toward him, not as an opponent, but as a witness, giving sworn truth. "You may not have typed those words, but you delivered them, one by one into a camera viewed by millions. You may not have approved the strategy, but you embodied it." Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in warmth. "The script was written. You just happened to speak it with a smile." The line landed like a gavel. Not shouted, not screamed, just true. And there was nothing more dangerous than that in a room designed to bury truth beneath performance. Knowles tried to recover, fast, as if sprinting ahead of an avalanche. "There's a difference between internal strategy and on-air messaging," he said. His voice shook, but only slightly, enough for the room to hear that he felt the tremor. "Commentary follows trends. The fact that something aligns doesn't mean I'm part of a scheme. It means I'm reacting to cultural shifts like anyone else in media. That's not conspiracy. It's broadcast reality. He gestured again, fingers cutting the air as if emphasis could conjure substance. But the logic was frayed. His tone, defensive. His words, increasingly disconnected from the control he once wielded. Jasmine turned toward the panel now, slow and deliberate. She wasn't theatrical, she was exact. "Let's be honest about what this is," she said. "This isn't debate, it isn't journalism, and it's definitely not independent thought." She pointed, not at him, but at the glowing email behind her. "That is not a viewpoint. That is a content directive, issued by executives, tracked by analytics, designed for outrage." The chamber stayed still. No notes were taken now. No side conversations. Just the hum of reality finally catching up to spectacle. She took a breath, not to calm herself, but to anchor the weight of what came next. "Mr. Knowles didn't give us an opinion. He gave us a performance." The word lingered like smoke, something you couldn't hold, but couldn't ignore. Then came the final strike. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She made it sharper, calmer, more lethal. "You didn't come here to argue a belief," she said. "You came here to defend a business model. You don't offer ideas, you produce content. And content has a script, a target, and a price." With that, she stepped back, hands still, shoulders level. Behind her, the screen faded to black, just long enough for the room to understand that the theater was over, and the truth had just taken center stage. The room had already absorbed too much, truths that didn't trend, headlines that never made it past outrage. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't speaking for headlines. She wasn't there to win a round. She was there to speak the names no one else had brought into the room. And she wasn't going to let this moment pass without them. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached into her folder and pulled out a single page. No visuals, no charts. Just a list, 4 names written in black ink, and in the weight behind them, a story that needed no formatting. She stepped forward, not for drama, but for closeness. She wanted the words to be heard not from behind a podium, but person to person. "Brianna Gay," she said, letting the name sit in the silence. "Tony McDade, Banco Brown, Allie Steinfeld." Her tone didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. Each name struck with the clarity of a bell toll, clear, full, impossible to ignore. All 4 were trans, all 4 were murdered, all in the past few years. Not because of some political disagreement, not because of debate, but because someone out there decided their existence was a threat. She didn't look at Knowles. She didn't need to. This wasn't about him, not yet. It was about them, about what had been lost long before he walked into this room, defending outrage as intellect. "These names are not content," she said. "They are people. They were sons, daughters, friends. And now, they're case files and candles on sidewalks." Then she looked down at the bottom of the page. One last line. A sentence scribbled in a diary by a teenage girl before she was found dead in a public park. Stabbed more than 10 times. Jasmine's voice softened. Not because she was unsure, but because the words were not hers to own. They belonged to someone who never got to finish the sentence. This was found in Brianna's diary, weeks before she was murdered. Jasmine paused, her throat tightening, but her voice steady, and then she read it aloud. "I'm tired of trying to prove that I deserve to exist." The room didn't breathe, not in the way rooms normally do. This wasn't reverence, it was weight, dead heavy stillness, the kind that only happens when something real finally pierces through the scripted noise. It was not a political statement, it wasn't an argument, it was a girl's final plea, spoken too late, but still echoing in a chamber built for policy, not pain. And Michael Knowles? He didn't speak. For the first time, the man who had spoken with certainty, with volume, with absolute control, said nothing. He remained seated, but his posture changed, not broken, but stalled. His hands didn't move. His mouth didn't open. Only his eyes betrayed him. They blinked, fast, uneven, like a man trying to reset, trying to push away what had already taken hold of the room. There was no comeback rehearsed for this, no citation that made it disappear, no clever phrasing to insulate him from the weight of a sentence written in the last days of a teenager's life. And Jasmine, she didn't smile, didn't twist the knife. She just stood there, holding space for a truth too long ignored, too often dismissed, and far too dangerous to keep pretending was academic. This wasn't performance. This was presence. This was the moment where the debate ended, and the cost became real. The lights were still hot, the studio still on air, but outside its walls, the world had already begun to move. What had started as a televised ambush was unraveling, live, raw, irreversible, and Jasmine Crockett, once positioned as a disposable foil, now stood as the voice millions hadn't realized they'd been waiting to hear. And as the final seconds of the broadcast ticked away, before the control room could wrench the feed off air, the truth had already escaped the building. One clip, one sentence, one line of clarity against decades of manipulation. That was all it took. Jasmine's final words, "This is justice," finally seen in full light, spread like fire through dry brush. And in the digital age, fire doesn't wait. Within minutes, phones were recording the screen. Within 20, clips had been ripped, captioned, subtitled, and posted. And within 2 hours, the internet didn't just react, it exploded. On Twitter, the hashtag #PiroExposed began trending by the half-hour mark, first in major cities, then nationally. Within 90 minutes, it had overtaken headlines in Washington, New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. The tag wasn't just political, it was personal. A stitched-together reckoning made of screenshots, transcripts, video fragments, and first-person accounts from women and guests who had once sat across from Janine and been treated as tools, not voices. Beside it, for "Let Truth Speak" surged in tandem, an anthem more than a slogan, written in thousands of posts that ranged from raw fury to quiet vindication. Tweets poured in from civil rights advocates, former newsroom interns, and ordinary viewers who had once tuned in to Janine's show and left feeling something they couldn't name until now. One tweet from a former black staffer at the network gained over 1 million views in under an hour. She once told me, "Don't bring guests who make the audience uncomfortable." Tonight, Jasmine Crockett made history by doing exactly that. Said on "Let Truth Speak." The floodgates had opened. Corporate America noticed fast. By the end of the second hour, 3 major sponsors, 2 financial firms and 1 global tech brand, issued separate but similarly worded public statements. The language was crisp, calculated, but the message underneath was unmistakable. "We are evaluating our ongoing partnership with the network in light of recent developments." Behind the polished PR language, the meaning was clear. Money was moving, and for the first time in years, not in Janine's favor. Internal memos began to circulate through ad agencies. Too volatile. No longer aligned with brand values. The shield of influence that had protected Janine for so long was no longer airtight. Because advertisers don't fear outrage. They fear accountability when outrage starts to sound like truth. And then came the letter. At 10:43 p.m. Eastern Time, just under 3 hours after the broadcast ended, a public statement began circulating from a coalition of 27 former federal prosecutors. Some had served under Republican administrations, others had served under Democrats. All of them had once sworn to uphold the rule of law. Now their signatures lined the bottom of a digital document titled "In Defense of Accountability," a public statement on truth in broadcasting. The second paragraph hit like a gavel. What the American public witnessed tonight was not chaos, it was clarity. For too long, truth has been sacrificed at the altar of manufactured outrage. Tonight, Representative Jasmine Crockett reclaimed the space where justice and truth are too often made invisible. This was not a media moment. This was a civic one. The letter was reshared by legal scholars, former judges, and sitting members of Congress within minutes. A quote from its closing line was picked up and repeated across major networks and independent outlets before sunrise. "This is not the collapse of a brand. This is the beginning of a reckoning, and it belongs to all of us." Every platform responded, Instagram filled with side-by-side images, Janine's stunned silence contrasted against Jasmine's unwavering stance. TikTok turned the 90-second uncut clip into a movement, stitched, recaptioned, remixed, with a generation too often tuned out suddenly leaning in. YouTube's homepage populated with reaction videos, breakdowns, and live streams where creators across the political spectrum said what had become obvious. This wasn't about politics, this was about power, and someone finally looked it in the eye. Meanwhile, Fox News executives met behind closed doors. The PR director's phone didn't stop vibrating. A senior producer had already drafted a statement. One anchor refused to go live until something is said, and across the newsroom, the chilling realization set in. The story had left the building. It was now in the hands of millions, and they weren't letting go. The truth had landed, not as an argument, not as an opinion, but as a rupture. And Jasmine Crockett, without theatrics, without spectacle, had pulled the pin. Now the aftershocks were erupting in real time. Fox News was the first to blink. Within hours of the clip surfacing, Knowles' face lit in green room fluorescence, his voice on loop across every platform. Producers cut the satellite link. No panel appearances, no remote commentary, no press releases explaining why. Just silence and the vanishing of a man who had once been a fixture in prime time. Then came the statement from the Daily Wire. Terse, corporate, and panicked. We are currently reviewing the role and responsibilities of Mr. Knowles as a platform contributor. The views expressed in the circulated recording do not reflect the editorial standards of this organization. But it was too late. The curtain had already been torn. What millions had suspected, they now heard in his own words. They believe I love Jesus. I only love money. Online, the reaction didn't build, it detonated. On Twitter, hashtags surged like a digital wave of reckoning. Knowles knew. Words kill. Jasmine was right. They climbed the ranks within minutes, crossing from American timelines into global ones. Screens lit up in every newsroom from London to Sao Paulo. College students reposted the hearing clip with handwritten signs. Survivors of hate crimes stitched together TikToks, overlaying Knowles' confession with their own trauma. Celebrities posted Jasmine's finger-pointing moment like it was a courtroom Mona Lisa. But none of it was driven by fandom. It was something deeper. A collective exhale from those who had been shouting into the void, now watching someone finally force the void to listen. Inside Capitol Hill, the aftermath was chaos hiding behind protocol. Press briefings doubled in length. Republican offices issued nervous clarifications. Several conservative PACs quietly scrubbed Knowles' past appearances from their video libraries. Aides passed around transcripts like legal contraband. But what no one could erase, what no one could spin, was the clarity of the exchange. Knowles, caught on tape, admitting it was all a performance. Jasmine standing tall, asking the one question the nation couldn't unhear. Who's really performing here? And outside that room, the consequences weren't just reputational. They were legal. Just 48 hours after the hearing, the Human Dignity Alliance, a coalition of civil rights attorneys, LGBTQ plus advocacy leaders, and First Amendment scholars, filed a historic motion in federal court. The case wasn't against Knowles as an individual. It was bigger, bolder. The plaintiffs asked the court to do something that had never been done in modern U.S. history, to recognize the deliberate erasure of a group's identity and public rhetoric as a form of federally recognized hate incitement. The motion cited not just Knowles' words, but the rising correlation between anti-trans rhetoric and hate crimes across multiple states. The evidentiary appendix was over 300 pages long. The legal framing was simple. When you call for the eradication of an identity and someone listens, you are not debating, you are inciting. Back in Washington, Jasmine didn't hold a press conference. She didn't make a victory lap. When asked by reporters if she had anticipated the fallout, she simply said, "No one should be surprised that truth has consequences." But that didn't mean she was untouched. Death threats flooded her congressional inbox. Her office received security briefings twice a day. Certain staffers had to be reassigned to off-site work. And still, she refused to take a leave of absence. She walked the halls of Capitol Hill exactly as she had before, shoulders back, jaw steady, eyes forward. Because she knew, For every person calling her dangerous, there were thousands more who finally felt seen. Meanwhile, right-wing influencers tried to mount a counteroffensive. They called it a deepfake. They questioned the timing of the leak. Some claimed Jasmine had staged the hearing for fame, but the damage couldn't be undone. You can't unring a bell, especially not when the whole world heard it, especially not when the voice on the recording admitted the performance was never about God or policy or conviction. It was always about the clicks, about the outrage, about the profit. In classrooms, Knowles's quote was dissected beside those of McCarthy and Father Coughlin. Professors paused to explain how hate, once mechanized, always metastasizes. In churches, sermons were rewritten. Some ministers denounced his cynicism from the pulpit. Others stayed silent, letting the clip play before bowing their heads. In boardrooms, network executives reviewed their own content pipelines, suddenly aware that accountability might not be coming softly next time. But the most striking shift was cultural. For years, trans people and their allies had been accused of exaggeration, of overreacting to just speech. But now, with one clip, one voice, one confession, the lie fell apart. Jasmine hadn't screamed. She hadn't dramatized. She just played the truth out loud. And that truth had done what policies and petitions had failed to. It made America stop pretending. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone understood. But everyone had heard. And sometimes in a country built on language, hearing the truth is the beginning of everything. Outside the hearing room, headlines were still spinning. Court filings were gaining traction. Social media trended like a storm. But inside the chamber, where everything had begun with cold ideology and talking points, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer about rhetoric. It wasn't about performance. It was about cost, measured not in votes or ad revenue, but in human weight. Jasmine Crockett stood still in that silence, not seeking attention, but ready to give voice to something far too small to shout and far too important to ignore. She didn't reach for a document this time. There were no exhibits, no screens lighting up behind her. What she held was folded once, tucked neatly into the inner lining of her blazer. Just a single sheet of paper, creased along the edges, written in pencil, smudged by a child's hand. She opened it with care like something fragile and looked up. Not at the committee, not at her opponent, but at the air above their heads. It was no longer about confronting someone. It was about protecting someone who couldn't be there. Last week, she began, her voice slower now, lower, drawing the room closer. I received a letter from a 12-year-old boy, a trans boy. She let that settle, just long enough for everyone in the room to recognize that what was coming next wasn't politics. It was personal. He didn't ask for policy. He didn't ask for protection. He didn't even ask for help. Her tone wasn't sorrowful. It was matter of fact, and that made it all the more devastating. What he asked, she said, unfolding the paper gently, was this. Her eyes scanned the page for the line she already knew by heart, but she didn't want to recite it from memory. She wanted to honor the boy who had written it. Then quietly she read aloud, Ms. Crockett, if I disappear, will anyone talk about me the way you talked on TV? The words hung in the air, like smoke from a fire no one wanted to admit was still burning. No one spoke. Not the panel, not the aides, not the crowd. The entire chamber held its breath, not in deference to her, but in the recognition of how close this was to everything they were pretending was abstract. You could feel the shame ripple through the air. Shame that this boy's question even made sense, that a child, barely into middle school, would be forced to think about legacy instead of life. Jasmine looked up again. Her eyes didn't water. Her voice didn't crack. Because this wasn't about her feelings. It was about the message she had been entrusted to carry, a message she had no right to ignore. He didn't ask if he mattered. He didn't ask if he was loved, she said. He asked if someone would say his name. After, if anyone would remember him, not for what he achieved, but simply for the fact that he existed. She took a breath, then exhaled. One slow, steady breath. I want every person in this room to hear me clearly, she said. I am not here to debate. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. I am here to make sure a child doesn't believe that death is the only way to be seen. There was no dramatic crescendo, no fist pounding, no tears, just the kind of unwavering clarity that cut deeper than fury ever could. Her words didn't land like accusations. They landed like truth spoken into a vacuum that had never made space for it before. And in that moment, it became painfully clear to everyone present. This hearing had never really been about free speech. It had been about who gets to feel seen before they vanish. Knowles said nothing, could say nothing. For all the times he had performed outrage, mocked vulnerability, preached certainty, there was no prepared line for this. His eyes flicked down, blinked fast, lingered on nothing in particular. He was still. For once, not because he was composed, but because he'd been met with something even he couldn't argue against. A child's exhausted fear of being forgotten. The cameras didn't pan. The audience didn't move. Even the air seemed to pause, as if the entire room was trying to understand how the most powerful country in the world had produced a boy who believed the only path to visibility was an obituary. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone under lights meant for confrontation, had chosen instead to bear witness. Not as a politician, not even as an advocate, but as the only adult in that room who had bothered to answer the question with more than silence. If I disappear, will anyone talk about me? Her answer wasn't written in legislation. It wasn't tied to any amendment. It was right there, in her presence, her stillness, her refusal to look away. She was already saying his name. Before, not after. And in doing so, she had done what no one else in that room had. She made that child visible, while he still had the chance to be. The words of the child still echoed like a heartbeat that didn't know how to fade. No one in the room had spoken for nearly a minute. Not because they were stunned, but because they were confronted. Every talking point had collapsed. Every debate tactic lay gutted under the weight of what had been said. Not with rage, not with drama, but with unbearable truth. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. She stood still for a breath, gathering not courage, but precision. What came next wouldn't be policy. It wouldn't be law. It would be something far more dangerous in Washington. Moral clarity. Slowly, she stepped back toward the microphone. The air around her felt thinner now, as if even the atmosphere was listening, afraid to interrupt what would come next. Her voice returned not with volume, but with finality. We can disagree on policy, she said, her tone steady as a blade. We can argue about budgets, regulations, frameworks. That is the work of this chamber. That is what democracy looks like. She looked across the dais, not challenging them, but indicting the silence that had allowed this moment to be necessary at all. But no one, she said, pausing just long enough to draw breath, no one has the right to call for the erasure of another human being and then hide behind two words: freedom. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just stood there, unchanged, unbent, unafraid. Her words sliced through the chamber like wind through glass, shattering every remaining defense. This was not rhetoric. It was truth spoken from the wound, aimed straight at the structure that had allowed people like Knowles to thrive off pain and call it philosophy. The moment didn't end in applause. It didn't need to. Some truths are too heavy for clapping. They don't demand praise. They demand change. Across the room, Knowles sat motionless. His chair creaked as he finally shifted, the first sound he'd made in several minutes. His face, once stiff with defiance, was now void of expression, not humbled, not remorseful, just empty, as if the weight of being unmasked had finally pressed into his chest hard enough to make breathing difficult. He stood slowly. There was no urgency to his movements, no energy left in his posture. No one rose with him, no aides trailed behind. No journalist rushed to catch a comment. Even the camera operator stayed fixed on Jasmine. The air around Knowles felt like a void, space cleared not out of respect, but out of rejection. He walked toward the side exit, shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. It was the sound of a departure, not just from the hearing, but from relevance. As he crossed through the heavy doors, the lights above him dimmed behind his back. First one, then another, then another. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. But in that fading light, something symbolic became inescapable. The performance was over. The theater had closed, and the audience had already turned their attention elsewhere. Outside the Capitol, the scene could not have been more different. A sea of people stretched down the steps and across the lawn, thousands strong. No chants, no music, just a quiet wall of presence. Many stood with coats pulled tight against the cold, but their arms were raised high, holding handmade signs, rain-wrinkled and marked with permanent marker. The messages varied, but one phrase rose above them all, simple, bold, unyielding: we exist. Some held the signs above their heads like shields. Others gripped them tight to their chests like lifelines. Children sat on shoulders. Elders stood with canes. Parents wrapped rainbow flags around their children's shoulders like armor. There was no central figure, no chant leader, no script. Just people, too many to count, who had waited far too long to be acknowledged by someone inside that building who spoke not about them, but for them. And inside the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett emerged. She stepped through the main doors, coat buttoned against the wind, flanked by security who kept their distance. Not because she asked them to, but because they understood the sacredness of this walk. She paused at the top of the marble steps. For a moment, she didn't speak. She didn't wave. She didn't gesture. She just looked out. At them. At all of them. The wind tugged at her coat. Cameras flashed from across the plaza. Her face, unsmiling, absorbed the crowd like someone listening to a language she already understood. The signs rose higher. The silence broke not with cheering, but with a long, low collective exhale, as if the breath that had been held through decades of dismissal was finally being released. And Jasmine nodded. Just once, not to signal triumph, not to claim victory, but to recognize that this moment belonged to them, not her, that everything she had said inside those walls, every line, every name, every silence, had only ever been borrowed from the people who had carried it long before she arrived. And in that quiet acknowledgement, she gave them back what had always been theirs: voice, presence, and place. Down below, a teenager wiped tears from their cheek and raised their sign higher. We exist! They didn't say it to provoke. They didn't say it to argue. They said it to be heard. And this time, they were. Fully, finally, unforgettably. The last words had been spoken. The lights above the hearing room dimmed. But the echo didn't leave with the crowd. It lingered, unseen, electric. Jasmine Crockett had stepped down from the platform, but the country she'd just spoken to wasn't the same anymore. And now, in the stillness that followed, came the part no one had prepared for: the reckoning within. Outside, the voices had risen, but inside, the lesson was just beginning to settle. Not in policy, not in law, but in the deep recesses of conscience where change either takes root or dies. What Jasmine had delivered wasn't just a takedown. It was a test, a mirror. One that asked every person watching not what side they were on, but what kind of human being they wanted to be when the cameras were off. Because somewhere between the arguments about free speech and the performances of righteousness, a truth had become impossible to ignore. Words don't just live online, they land. And sometimes they land like bullets. The most chilling thing Jasmine revealed wasn't Knowles' greed or even his cruelty. It was his clarity. That calm, confident confession caught on tape. They believe I love Jesus. I only love money. That wasn't a slip. That was a strategy. And in that moment, the whole room understood. This wasn't about values. It was about revenue. The cruelty had been industrialized. The outrage was scheduled. The violence, outsourced, distributed to those watching, reading, reacting. And some of them, as history has shown us, act. That's the lesson we've tried not to learn. That hate doesn't always wear a mask or scream from a podium. Sometimes it smiles in a blazer and quotes scripture. Sometimes it says eradicate in the same tone it says freedom. And when that language goes unchecked, when it becomes normalized, sanitized, repackaged as culture war entertainment, it doesn't just influence, it incites. And Jasmine Crockett knew that. But the greater lesson, the one buried deep in her closing words, wasn't just about power. It was about dignity, about who has to earn it, about who is expected to justify their right to breathe while others weaponize that breath for attention. It was about the 12-year-old child who wrote to her, not for comfort, not even for visibility, but to ask whether, if he vanished, someone would say his name. That wasn't a question about fame. It was a question about worth. And Jasmine didn't respond with a policy proposal. She didn't tell him to be brave. She stood in front of the nation and said what needed to be said. I am not here to debate. I am here to make sure a child doesn't believe that death is the only way to be seen. That is the line history will remember, because it is the line that shifts the entire weight of the conversation from theory to reality. It calls out the cowardice of framing erasure as expression. It dares every platform, every network, every pundit, and every citizen to ask, at what point do we stop pretending we don't know what we're doing? The human lesson isn't abstract, it's brutal. It tells us that every time we excuse someone like Knowles with, he's just speaking his mind, we are making someone else's existence a little less safe, a little less possible. And when enough of those little acts of erasure pile up, people disappear, not just from the news cycle, from the world. This isn't an argument about censorship. It's a confrontation with conscience. It asks, when does speech become cruelty? When does profit become complicity? When does policy become violence dressed in a suit? Jasmine Crockett didn't answer that for us. She demanded that we answer it for ourselves. Because here's what we learned. When a child has to ask if he'll be remembered, he already believes he's invisible. When a woman stands alone in a hearing and reads his words out loud, she is not just protecting him, she is indicting us. And when millions listen and finally feel something break, it means there's still time to rebuild. Jasmine never called herself a hero. She didn't posture. She didn't perform. She simply refused to be silent in the face of something so calculated, so dressed in values. It had fooled a nation into mistaking harm for honesty. That's not bravery, that's responsibility. And that's what we forgot somewhere along the way. The human lesson here is not about trans rights. It's not about left or right. It's not even about Knowles. It's about what kind of society we are when the most vulnerable are asking not for power, but for mercy. It's about whether we see existence as something to be defended or debated. It's about the moment we realize that every time we say, it's just a different opinion, a child somewhere is wondering whether they were ever real to begin with. And Jasmine? She answered that question without needing permission, without waiting for polling, without waiting for someone else to go first. She stood up and said, you are real. I see you. You matter now. Not just when it's too late. That is the kind of courage this country needs. Not because it sounds good, but because without it, we are already lost. So no, this wasn't just a hearing. It was a mirror. And the reflection we saw wasn't pretty, but thanks to Jasmine Crockett, we saw it clearly. Now the question is, what are we going to do with what we saw? And so the mirror didn't just reflect the truth, it demanded a response. The lesson was never meant to end in silence. It was meant to provoke a decision, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just shown us what was wrong. She had drawn a line, and now the rest of us must choose where we stand. This is no longer a spectator's moment. This is not a tragedy to scroll past, or a headline to repost with outrage and forget by dinner. This is the line where we stop pretending that neutrality is noble, where we stop letting people profit off hate while hiding behind polished lighting and studio microphones. What Jasmine revealed in that hearing wasn't just a man or a network or a memo. She revealed a system, one that feeds on fear, one that conditions us to look away when a marginalized kid whispers that they're tired of fighting to exist. And that system doesn't collapse because one woman spoke. It collapses when we act. So what does action look like? It's more than protest, more than performance. It's policy, it's pressure, it's naming names in boardrooms and ballot boxes. It's making sure that what happened in that chamber doesn't become another fleeting moment of outrage that dies beneath the weight of the next scandal. Action means demanding that hate speech, when wrapped in ideology, is no longer protected by tradition. It means calling on lawmakers to write what Jasmine said into federal recognition, that calling for the erasure of human identity is not opinion, it is incitement. It starts with letters. It grows into laws. But it also lives in classrooms, in town halls, in family dinners where silence has been easier than confrontation. We have to stop flinching at discomfort. We have to stop letting the loudest voices set the terms of debate. We need to write into our school curriculums the truth of marginalized history. We need to teach that dignity is not a partisan topic. We need to flood the phone lines of every representative who flinched when asked to condemn violence disguised as belief. And we need to do it not for applause, but because every second we don't, another child wonders if their disappearance would finally make someone care. We cannot let that boy's question go unanswered. If I disappear, will anyone talk about me the way you did on TV? Jasmine answered him with courage. But one voice, no matter how strong, is not enough. That voice needs to multiply. In the media we consume, in the values we elect, in the laws we demand, in the conversations we stop avoiding. We can't change everything overnight, but we can make it impossible to ignore. We can make it expensive, socially, politically, financially, to dehumanize others for clicks. This means pulling ads from platforms that platform hate. It means boycotting networks that profit off cruelty. It means writing to school boards, to Congress, to corporate sponsors and saying, not in our name, not anymore. Because letting this fade means telling every trans kid, every queer teen, every person who's been told they are too much, too different, too political, that they were right to be afraid, and they weren't. We must turn Jasmine's hearing into more than a story. It must become a blueprint. She modeled what bravery looks like in a room built to break people like her. She sat there, stone-faced against ridicule, unmoved by the applause of those waiting for her to fail. She stood, not because she was fearless, but because she feared what would happen if no one else did. That is the kind of action we must now reflect. Not performative, not episodic, but sustained, focused. Loud when necessary, quiet when listening, but always present. It is time we make hate unprofitable. Make empathy louder. Make protection proactive, not reactive. Make visibility a right, not a risk. And above all, we must remember, action doesn't begin in Washington. It begins with us, in what we teach, how we vote, where we show up, what we refuse to tolerate. Jasmine Crockett handed us the microphone, and now it's our turn to speak. Not just into cameras, but into institutions, into communities, into history. Because if we don't answer now, clearly, loudly, relentlessly, then we've learned nothing. And that 12-year-old boy's letter will become prophecy, and we will be the ones who proved him right. Don't let that happen. Speak, move, act. Now, if you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a hearing. It wasn't just a debate. It wasn't about two people sparring over ideology. What you've just witnessed, what Jasmine Crockett forced the world to witness, was something far more dangerous and far more urgent. A line being drawn in real time between power and humanity, between cruelty and conscience, between what we allow and what we refuse to ever allow again. Jasmine stood in that chamber not because she wanted to win, but because someone had to stop pretending that freedom means silence for some and a megaphone for others. She stood not just for the boy who asked if his name would matter, not just for the thousands outside shouting, "We exist," but for every voice that's been dismissed as inconvenient. And now, that voice needs you, not in a metaphorical way, not tomorrow, right now. Because the truth is, if we don't carry this story further, it disappears. The clip fades, the algorithm buries it. The outrage becomes yesterday's headline, and the 12-year-old watching from his bedroom window learns exactly what the world does with people like him, forgets them. And if that happens, then everything Jasmine stood for, everything she risked, it becomes performance instead of power. That cannot be allowed. So we're asking you, not politely, not softly, urgently, like this video. Share it, subscribe. Yes, it's just a button, but it's also a signal, a small act of defiance against an internet trained to reward conflict and suppress compassion. Every like pushes this message further. Every subscribe tells the algorithm, This matters. Every share puts Jasmine's words into another timeline, another city, another family, another classroom, where maybe, just maybe, it saves someone from believing their disappearance would make more noise than their existence. And let's be clear, we don't have sponsors backing this. We don't have billion-dollar studios. We don't have cable contracts cushioning our convictions. What we have is each other. What we have are viewers like you who understand that storytelling isn't entertainment when lives are on the line. That truth is oxygen in a room built to suffocate the most vulnerable. And right now, we are asking you to help us keep that oxygen flowing. Because silence doesn't just happen, it's engineered, curated. And every time someone like Jasmine breaks through it, the system scrambles to erase her again, to drown her out, to bury her words beneath scandal, spin, and spectacle. But we don't have to let that happen. We can be the reason her voice keeps echoing. We can be the reason this isn't just another viral moment, but the beginning of a movement that doesn't fade with the trending tab. When you like this video, it's not about metrics, it's about momentum. When you subscribe to this channel, it's not about boosting numbers, it's about building a platform big enough to protect the voices they're trying to silence. And when you comment, when you share your own story, your own rage, your own hope, you're not just engaging. You're telling every 12-year-old watching that they're not alone, that people are listening, that people care, that people will fight for them even when they're too tired to fight for themselves. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't stand in that room to go viral. She stood there because someone had to tell the truth and not blink. She stood there because no one else would. Now it's your turn, because watching is not enough. Being moved is not enough. Tears are not action. Anger is not change. Not unless it's followed by something, anything. Start here. Start with the click. Start with the share. But don't stop there. Tell someone. Show someone. Send this to your local representative. Tag the networks that stayed silent. Demand coverage. Demand legislation. Demand better. This hearing can't end in applause. It must end in action. And this platform, this community, we are building it to make sure that happens. We are here to tell the stories others are too afraid to touch. We are here to give names back to those erased, but we can't do it alone. We shouldn't. So if you've ever felt powerless watching injustice unfold, if you've ever sat in silence because you didn't know what to say, this is what you can do. Right now, right here, like, subscribe, share, then say something, anything. Don't worry about being perfect. Just be present, because what Jasmine taught us isn't just that words can kill. She taught us that words can also save, but only if they're heard. Only if they reach the kids still waiting for someone to say, "I see you." Only if they reach the person standing on the edge, wondering if anyone would notice if they fell. Only if they reach a nation still waking up from the lie that being silent is being neutral. You are not neutral. By watching this far, you've already chosen. Now back that choice with something real, like subscribe, share. Because this isn't a video, it's a voice. And now, it's yours. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed Capitol hearing unlike any in U.S. history, Representative Jasmine Crockett faces off against billionaire Warren Buffett, armed not with anger, but with evidence. The issue: a bombshell leak reveals Buffett paid less in taxes than a parking lot worker, and Jasmine is the first to call it out, on national television with the world watching. As silence deepens, truths unravel, and power shifts, one question freezes the room. What has Buffett really done with 70 years of unchecked influence? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It began on a Thursday morning unlike any other in Washington, D.C. The marble pillars of the U.S. Capitol cast long shadows over the swelling crowd, and inside an emergency congressional hearing had been convened under a title as cold and clinical as it was explosive. Tax loopholes and moral responsibility in high net worth individuals. The gravity behind the words was unmistakable. Just days earlier, an unprecedented leak of confidential IRS data had stunned the nation. An expose that revealed dozens of billionaires had paid little to no federal income tax over multiple years. At the top of that list was a name no one expected to see: Warren Edward Buffett, America's oracle of humble wealth and public goodwill. His reputation, decades in the making, was now tethered to the same system millions of struggling Americans believed had been rigged against them. The Capitol, usually sterile with protocol, throbbed with urgency. Security tripled. Reporters elbowed for space. Foreign correspondents set up live feeds. No one knew exactly what would unfold inside the chamber, but everyone knew history was about to happen. Across the country, outrage clashed with reverence. Some still saw Buffett as the generous sage of Omaha. Others saw a man who mastered a rigged system while workers paid more in taxes than he ever did. Protesters gathered outside with signs reading, "Philanthropy isn't accountability," and "Justice before generosity." Inside the chamber, cameras tracked every movement. Then the doors opened. Warren Buffett entered, calm, unshaken, smiling faintly like it was business as usual. But this was no shareholders' meeting. This was a reckoning. Then came the name. Unexpected, electric, and undeniable. The chair recognizes Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas for the first round of questioning. The room tensed. A split-second pause followed, as if the air itself had been sucked out. Jasmine Crockett, the firebrand attorney-turned-congresswoman known for shredding judicial hypocrisy and speaking raw truths no one else dared say. The room's energy shifted immediately. This was no longer going to be a polite discussion of policy. This was about to become a political trial, with no judge but a jury of 330 million watching live. Buffett looked toward her with quiet curiosity. She hadn't spoken yet, but everyone could feel it. When she did, the tone of the entire nation would change. And then, she stood. Not quickly, not theatrically, just deliberately, like someone who knew every eye in the room was already locked on her. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise to speak. She rose to confront. The shift was almost imperceptible, but palpable. The kind of shift that doesn't happen when a politician asks a question, but when someone dares to speak from a place that hasn't been softened by power or protected by money. Across the table, Warren Buffett sat like a monument from another era. His silver hair neatly parted, suit modest in tone, but unmistakably tailored. There was a studied gentleness to his posture, the relaxed confidence of someone who had faced cameras and congressional panels for decades and always walked out untouched. His hands rested neatly in front of him. His expression was calm, maybe too calm, but Jasmine didn't come to be polite. She didn't come to exchange prepared statements or volley economic jargon. She came as a vessel for millions of Americans who'd been told their struggle was inevitable, their taxes non-negotiable, their dreams too expensive. She came with the voices of single mothers working night shifts, war veterans denied benefits, and college graduates drowning in debt while billionaires structured shell companies for sport. She came with clarity and with fire, and her first words hit the chamber like a jolt of voltage through still water. "Mr. Buffett, do you feel even the slightest shame knowing you've paid less in taxes than a parking attendant at a Target in my district?" A quiet ripple moved through the room. Not noise, just tension, rippling like heat off pavement. Staffers stopped typing. Senators leaned back ever so slightly. Buffett blinked slowly, then tilted his head, wearing the same restrained smile he'd worn through every interview that ever tried to challenge him. And then, with the calm cadence of someone who believed in his own moral insulation, he said, "I've followed the law as written. I've always fulfilled my duties as a citizen." The words were expected, safe, rehearsed, wrapped in technical correctness. But Jasmine didn't react. She didn't sigh, didn't scoff. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned ever so slightly forward, closing not a physical gap, but a moral one. Her voice lowered, but every syllable landed like the strike of a gavel. "The issue isn't whether you broke the law, sir. The issue is who wrote the law and for whom. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted again, this time permanently. This was no longer a hearing, it was a mirror, one that forced everyone in that room and everyone watching to decide what they saw when they looked at a man who had long been called wise, generous, untouchable, and what it meant when someone finally refused to pretend his comfort was a stand-in for justice. There was no time to recover. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come here to play chess. She'd come with receipts, and she was just getting started. The room, already stiff with tension, now felt like the air itself had thickened. Warren Buffett remained composed, at least outwardly, but something in his posture had shifted. Barely, but noticeably. The way his shoulders settled lower, the way his fingers fidgeted with the corner of the table. Small tells, but tells all the same. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even pause for the weight of her last question to land. Instead, she reached with quiet precision to her side and pulled a thick binder across the desk. The cover was blunt. Confidential. Internal portfolio records. Berkshire Hathaway Holdings. She didn't slam it. She didn't need to. Just the fact that it was there, in front of him, in public, was enough to turn silence into pressure. She flipped open the binder slowly, methodically. Not for effect, but like someone preparing to take a scalpel to a narrative that had gone unchallenged for too long. Her tone stayed steady, calm, almost eerily so. "Let's look past slogans and speeches for a minute, Mr. Buffett," she said, scanning the first page. "Let's talk about where your money actually went." She lifted a printed document high enough for the cameras to catch. "This is a holding disclosure from your firm. Your capital was funneled into a Brazilian agribusiness group that's been cited multiple times for illegal deforestation in the Amazon. We're not talking a few trees. We're talking tens of thousands of acres stripped bare. We're talking rivers rerouted, indigenous families pushed off land they've lived on for generations. That land was cleared for soy farming, and Berkshire funded the machinery that did it." She let the page fall. Her voice remained composed but colder now, stripped of the formalities. "You don't get to talk about legacy while financing land grabs, sir. That's not being a wise investor. That's being a silent partner in destruction." Buffett didn't reply. He blinked and only slightly tilted his head, as if trying to recall a specific board meeting years ago. But she was already moving. She turned to another section of the binder. This time she held up a page stamped with the Wells Fargo logo. We all remember the Wells Fargo scandal. Millions of fake accounts. Fraud. People's credit destroyed, bank fees charged on accounts they didn't even open. And there you were, one of the largest shareholders at the time. While the bank was defrauding working-class Americans, you sat on your shares. You didn't speak up. You didn't pull out. You waited for the media storm to pass. Her voice cracked slightly, not out of emotion, but from the weight of truth being carried for too long. You had the power to stop it, but you didn't. And I want to ask you, was it loyalty or was it just math? She didn't wait for an answer. She wasn't done. Next came a black-tabbed folder labeled Energy Assets. Rural Zones. Jasmine opened it slowly. The tone in the room changed. Even members of the committee began to shift in their seats. Now we get to the coal investments. Wyoming, West Virginia. You poured hundreds of millions into mining operations tied directly to environmental damage and, yes, health crises. She read directly from the document. Increased cancer rates, respiratory diseases, contaminated drinking water, whole communities, some of them indigenous, some of them just poor and forgotten, living downwind of profit margins. She raised her eyes and looked Buffett dead in the face. "And in your own strategy memo, your firm called these high-yield rural opportunities. That's the language you use to justify poisoning kids whose parents can't afford to leave." Her voice was clear now, unshaking, and then she let it land. "No one forced you to invest. You chose to pour money into silence, and you call that an economic decision." The room was frozen. A single exhale from a staffer behind her broke the stillness, and even that felt too loud. Buffett didn't speak. His hands were no longer folded. They now gripped the edges of the desk, not dramatically, not obviously, but the way a man does when gravity shifts beneath his chair. Jasmine closed the binder quietly, her fingertips resting atop it like sealing a truth that could no longer be ignored. Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in tone, like a verdict being read. Mr. Buffett, people in my district are paying 22% of their income in federal taxes while living paycheck to paycheck. You paid zero legally for multiple years, and you know that. You know that because your team found every line, every loophole, every exemption the system handed you. And still, you kept taking. She straightened her shoulders, letting the silence between them speak louder than any rebuttal. This country worships wealth, but wealth is not wisdom, and avoiding responsibility, just because it's legal, is not leadership. She stepped back from the mic, binder still closed in front of her. She didn't look for validation. She didn't need it, because in that moment, she had done what no one else had dared. Not just question Warren Buffett's money, but confront what that money had bought: silence, protection, and power. And now finally exposure. The silence that followed Jasmine's final words wasn't passive, it was active. It filled the hearing room like a rising tide, cold and heavy. Everyone felt it, not just the weight of her evidence, but the audacity of her tone. It was the kind of silence that doesn't demand a response. It demands accountability. Warren Buffett, for the first time in a long time, sat on the wrong end of power, and everyone knew it. He didn't reach for water. He didn't shift in his chair. He simply exhaled, a soft, almost imperceptible breath, as if steadying himself before walking into a storm he never thought he'd have to face. Then he moved. It was small, a slight lean toward the microphone, a subtle lift of the chin, the practiced precision of a man who'd spent decades navigating public scrutiny without ever truly being touched by it. His hands folded in front of him once more, returning to their familiar position, controlled, deliberate. His voice, when it came, was exactly what people expected: calm, low, unshaken. It was the voice of a man used to explaining the world on his terms. "I don't manage those companies directly," he said, his tone free of defensiveness, almost gentle. "I invest in them. I trust their leadership to operate within the bounds of the law and within the standards they've laid out." He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. It was a line he'd given before, perhaps in interviews, perhaps in meetings, but now under oath and under fire, it landed differently. The room didn't relax. No nods of approval followed. If anything, the stillness deepened. Jasmine remained silent, staring directly at him, not in anger, but in measured disbelief. Buffett pressed on, choosing his next words with the same care a surgeon might use when cutting near an artery. "And I've given away over $50 billion to causes around the world. I don't do that for recognition. I don't do it to avoid criticism. I do it because I believe in giving back." He glanced toward a few members of the committee, perhaps looking for understanding, perhaps reassurance. But the faces staring back at him weren't offering either, because the room wasn't judging his tone. It was judging his distance. From consequences, from communities, from the truth Jasmine had just put on the record. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. What he said next came quietly, but with finality, like someone stating a fact they believed to be self-evident. "I don't do politics. I never have. I only invest. I believe that's where I do the most good." And with that, he leaned back, not smugly, but with the confidence of someone who had said what he believed needed to be said. To him, perhaps, that was enough. After all, for much of his life, those words had been enough. They had earned him praise. They had insulated him from outrage. They had allowed him to walk freely between boardrooms and benefit galas, all while avoiding the hard conversations about what his money built and who it harmed. But this time, something had changed. No applause followed, no respectful nods. The hearing chamber remained motionless. The silence that followed wasn't about reverence. It was about reckoning, because his answers, while smooth and technically sound, carried something else underneath: detachment. A studied, practiced distance from the consequences his investments had created. He had drawn clear lines between himself and the damage, but Jasmine had already erased those lines, one by one. And now everyone watching, inside that room across the country, understood what was happening. For the first time in his career, Warren Buffett was being held accountable not for what he did directly, but for what he empowered through silence. The next move would not be his. It belonged to Jasmine. And the nation was still watching. But in that stillness, after all the smooth answers and softly spoken rationalizations, something in the room began to fracture. Not visibly, not loudly, but deeply. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, not out of peace, but out of disbelief. Warren Buffett had said everything he was supposed to say, that he didn't run the companies directly, that he gave away billions, that he stayed out of politics, and yet none of it landed the way it used to. None of it settled the tension in the chamber, because everyone, on the dais, in the gallery, across the airwaves, could feel what had just happened. He had defended the architecture of power without acknowledging the weight of what it built. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She stood at the same microphone, the same height, the same tone, but everything around her had shifted. She could feel the breath of the moment tightening in her chest, not from nerves, but from the realization that this was the moment. Not the beginning of the hearing, not the evidence folder, not even the recordings. This was the pulse, the heartbeat, the moment where power was no longer protected by politeness. She leaned in, not to confront, not to provoke, but to speak with the clarity of someone who had been told their entire life that truth only matters when it's comfortable. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to, because the sharpest blade doesn't shout, it cuts. If you don't manage, don't control, and don't do politics, then what have you done with all that power for 70 years, Mr. Buffett, besides keeping it for yourself? The room stopped breathing. Not a chair creaked. Not a cough broke the air. Buffett didn't flinch, but his face, his carefully calibrated, investor-tested, media-approved face, froze. Not in fear, not in offense, in something far more dangerous, exposure. Because what Jasmine had asked wasn't just about money or markets or investment ethics. It was about legacy, about the quiet comfort of a man who had lived for decades in the assumption that being good with money made him good by default. Her question pulled that assumption into the light, and under that light, it didn't look like wisdom. It looked like avoidance. It looked like detachment. It looked like something America had allowed for far too long, power with no obligation to justice. Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't step back. She simply held her ground, letting the silence answer what Buffett couldn't. Because some questions don't need replies. They demand reckoning. And in that moment, no amount of philanthropy, no library wing named after him, no award or interview or carefully worded op-ed could erase what had just been asked. The question wasn't whether Warren Buffett had done wrong. It was whether, in a lifetime of being untouched by the consequences of his investments, he had ever truly done right. The silence didn't fade. It matured into something heavier. No one in the room was moving now. Jasmine Crockett's last question still hovered like smoke from a controlled demolition. But even that wasn't the full collapse. She knew legacy wasn't destroyed by one blow. It was peeled back, fact by fact, word by word, until there was nothing left to shield it from the truth. And she had one more layer to strip away, one more wall to breach. Not with rhetoric, not with outrage, but with what the man sitting across from her had never expected to face in public. His own words. She reached for a black folder, no thicker than a dozen pages, but what it contained was the kind of material that could flip reputations on their back. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. Because what she held wasn't just evidence. It was intent, captured in real time. Jasmine held the page up for the cameras, the bold font unmistakable, the signature at the bottom chilling in its familiarity. "This is from 2018, she began, locking eyes with Buffett, an internal message sent directly from Mr. Buffett's account. There was no need for theatrics. The words spoke for themselves. ESG reports might stir noise. Silence is a better strategy in this cycle. That was it. One sentence, but it echoed like a verdict. ESG, environmental, social, and governance. was the standard Buffett was praised for following. Entire books had been written, citing him as the moral compass of capitalism. And yet, here was a sentence that pulled back the curtain. When scrutiny threatened returns, silence wasn't just tolerated, it was strategic. Jasmine's tone didn't shift. She didn't have to hammer the point. She let the weight of it settle. "That's not caution," she said calmly. "That's calculation." She turned to the next page, slower this time, not to delay, but to let everyone realize that the first document was no anomaly. She read from a second, thicker page. The bold red confidential across the top wasn't decoration. It was warning. But it had made its way into the hearing anyway, because this time, the silence was no longer in Buffett's control. This internal policy guidance from Berkshire's compliance division urges executives to avoid engagement with media regarding tax strategy disclosures in order to preserve shareholder value. Her voice was steady, clear, not a trace of accusation, only the kind of clarity that no PR team could dilute. She looked around, not to grandstand, but because she wanted every person in the room to understand what had just been said. These weren't mistakes. These weren't oversights. These were deliberate structures built to keep power protected and truth contained. Then she turned back to Buffett, her voice lowering, not in volume, but in temperature. "You weren't just silent, sir. You built silence into your system." The effect was immediate. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Senators who had once leaned back were now upright. Journalists typed faster. Even the aides behind the committee stopped whispering. What Jasmine had just revealed wasn't about policy, it was about design. A billionaire hadn't just taken advantage of a broken system, he had worked to keep it quiet long enough for it to continue working for him. And in that moment, Warren Buffett wasn't a sage. He wasn't an icon. He was just a man with emails, memos, and decades of choices he thought would never see daylight. The room was no longer tense. It was suspended, like a breath being held by an entire nation. And in the center of that breath sat Warren Buffett, no longer wrapped in the untouchable glow of legacy, but placed, finally, under the same fluorescent glare as every name ever called to account. For most of the hearing, he had worn composure like armor. He had answered every question with a kind of worn-down eloquence, the kind that decades of interviews and board meetings had hardened into instinct. But now that Jasmine had laid down not just documents, but intent, his edges began to blur. It started in the smallest of ways, a crease at the center of his forehead, the slightest narrowing of the eyes. Then, almost reflexively, his hand rose and scratched the side of his head. An involuntary motion, human and revealing. The room caught it. So did the cameras. And Jasmine didn't need to say a word. The moment had already said everything. For the first time, Warren Buffett looked uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't defensive, but it lacked the calm weight it once carried. It no longer moved the room. It simply filled space. "Those documents may have been leaked out of context," he said, the syllables less crisp than before. "I've always believed in transparency." He tried to make it sound reasonable, responsible, like the kind of line you'd hear in an investor letter or a televised apology with a PR team standing just off camera. But this wasn't CNBC. This was a room full of people who'd been forced to live within the systems his silence had shaped. And for once, words like transparency no longer felt like a shield. They felt like deflection. There was no ripple of agreement, no murmurs of defense. No one leaned forward to nod. And Jasmine knew it. She had him exposed, not because he said something wrong, but because he had nothing left to say that felt right. She leaned in, not with force, but with focus. Her tone didn't change. Her posture didn't shift. She was steady, unapologetically direct. "Then give me one example, just one, where you directed one of your companies to disclose the harm they caused." The precision of the challenge was surgical. She wasn't asking for a general philosophy. She wasn't asking for rhetoric. She was demanding something specific, a line in the sand, a moment of accountability, something real. And he had nothing. Buffett looked down, not dramatically, not in surrender, but in that unmistakable way people do when they realize the truth is already written and it didn't favor them. His fingers tapped the edge of the table, then stopped. His mouth opened slightly as if something might come. But nothing did. His legal team remained frozen. No one passed him a lifeline. No committee member interrupted to pivot. No friendly voice filled the void. Because the void was the answer. The man once praised as the moral investor, the steady hand of American capitalism, now sat speechless. Not because he was defeated, but because he had never before been required to account for the space between legality and conscience. And now the entire country could see it. His silence wasn't strategy, it wasn't wisdom. It was an absence of action where action had always been possible. And Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The silence was doing all the speaking she needed. The silence that followed Buffett's failure to answer was no longer just discomfort. It was indictment. The weight of his inaction hung visibly in the air, not theoretical anymore, but personal. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to let the silence speak for too long. She had come with more than questions, more than documents. She had come prepared to puncture not just the myth of Buffett's moral standing, but the shield of access and influence that had protected him for decades. And now the moment had arrived. With a calmness that unnerved, Jasmine reached into the side of her folder and placed a small recorder on the desk in front of her. She didn't explain it. She didn't introduce it. She simply pressed play. The speakers in the hearing room clicked alive, their low hum giving way to a voice that was instantly recognizable. Clear, composed, familiar. But what it said, and how it was said, hit the room like a blade to glass. I'm not worried about any of those new tax bills. 3 people on that committee have had dinner at my house. They need me more than I need them. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The casual tone of the recording made it worse. It wasn't a man under pressure. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was Warren Buffett, comfortable, candid, and absolutely confident that the system would bend before it would ever touch him. In 9 seconds, the illusion of separation between wealth and power shattered completely. No one spoke. No one could. The room wasn't just quiet, it was paralyzed. The statement didn't require analysis or political framing. It didn't invite debate. It was clarity in its rawest, most devastating form. The kind of clarity that doesn't beg for outrage because it has already bypassed disbelief. A few rows behind Buffett, one of his longtime legal advisors, a man in his 60s with years of courtroom discipline etched into his posture, sank slightly in his seat. He brought a hand to his face and covered his eyes. Not dramatically, not performatively, just instinctively, like someone realizing that what had just been said was not survivable in public. Across the dais, a senator from the Democratic side, until now mostly silent, let out a long, audible breath. It wasn't anger. It wasn't theater. It was something heavier, disappointment laced with complicity. No one defended Buffett. No one offered clarification. The committee staff stopped scribbling. Even the background sounds, the faint coughs, the shifting chairs, went still. In that moment, the room had transformed from a hearing chamber to a mirror, and what it reflected was brutal. Power doesn't just protect itself, it courts loyalty, hosts dinner, and makes sure the people writing the rules know exactly who funded the wine. But even as the final syllables of the recording faded into silence, the weight of those words remained, anchored deep in the bones of the room. No one moved, no one dared. It wasn't the content alone that stunned the chamber, but the ease with which it had been said. The entitlement, the familiarity, the ownership of power too casually confessed. It was the kind of sentence that didn't require a press release or fact check. It required a reckoning. And Warren Buffett, once seen as the gentleman titan of capitalism, now sat in a chair that suddenly felt smaller than the one he walked in with. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked around, not with arrogance, not even with defense, but with a strange quietness, as if realizing too late that the old playbook had run out of pages. His gaze swept across the panel, not to make a point, but to search for refuge. The lawmakers avoided his eyes. One picked up a pen and started scribbling nothing. Another straightened a glass of water that didn't need straightening. The attorneys beside him, once statues of confidence, now remained frozen. No whispers, No passing of notes, no procedural lifelines. Then came the smallest sign, the faintest tremor in his hands as they adjusted his microphone. And finally the voice. It was lower now, absent the calculated cadence of a seasoned executive. This was not Warren Buffett, the icon. This was Warren Buffett, the man, cornered by his own recorded candor. I don't recall the context of that remark. The words were soft, measured, and completely powerless. They didn't fill the room. They didn't soothe. They landed with a thud, a hollow offering against the weight of what had just been heard. It wasn't denial. It wasn't contrition. It was distance. And in this moment, distance was the most dangerous thing he could offer. Because across from him, Jasmine Crockett had not come to debate policy. She had come to demand accountability, not just for the numbers, but for the culture that allowed someone to say those words and expect no consequence. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She stood still, grounded not in anger, but in absolute clarity. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. Because when truth is this clear, it doesn't need volume. It needs direction. Maybe the law doesn't forbid what you've done, but today the American people are judging something the law forgot to include: morality. The final word dropped like a gavel, not in tone but in weight. It didn't accuse. It convicted. Quietly, completely. It wasn't about whether Buffett remembered the context. It was about why he believed he'd never have to. In that moment, the hearing wasn't just about taxes or influence or dinner parties behind closed doors. It was about what happens when the most powerful man in the room is finally forced to answer a question he can't outsource, rewrite, or dissolve with a donation. It was about a truth so long suppressed that when spoken aloud, it felt revolutionary. Buffett didn't reply. He couldn't. Because some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be faced. And then she stepped back, not in triumph, not in exhaustion, but in stillness. Jasmine Crockett returned to her seat without turning around, without a glance toward the cameras, the crowd, or even Warren Buffett himself. Her arms folded loosely across her chest, her jaw set not in tension, but in something quieter: confirmation. She had said everything she came to say. She had asked the question no one else ever dared to. And in that chamber, thick with silence, it felt less like the end of a hearing and more like the end of an era. But the reckoning wasn't finished. No sooner had Jasmine's heels touched the floor beneath her chair than the unexpected happened. Yet it didn't feel unexpected to her. The great wooden door at the rear of the chamber, the one typically reserved for private exits and late arrivals, burst open with a decisive, practiced swing. The sound cut clean through the tension, not loud but commanding, like a single match struck in a room full of gas. Two figures entered in dark suits. No applause, no announcement, just precision. The gold badge glinting on the belt of the lead agent was unmistakable. FBI. A few staffers on the perimeter froze mid-step. One of the court reporters lifted her eyes in confusion, blinking rapidly as if not trusting what she was seeing. A sharp gasp escaped somewhere in the gallery, but the agents did not pause. They walked straight through the center aisle, the sound of their shoes on marble like a drumbeat echoing into the heartbeat of history. The lead agent stopped just 3 feet from the witness table, unfolded a sheet of paper from a slim leather folder, and read in a voice that was both clear and absolute: Warren Edward Buffett, you are now the subject of an active federal investigation into allegations of legislative manipulation and violations of federal financial disclosure statutes. This inquiry is authorized by the United States Department of Justice. You have the right to remain silent. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They hit with the same finality as a judge's gavel, but carried the raw shock of betrayal, the kind that turns a room of bystanders into a sea of stunned witnesses. You could feel the oxygen being sucked out of the room. The silence that had defined the last several minutes now imploded into chaos. The room erupted, not with noise at first, but with motion. Journalists sprang from their seats, fingers flying across keyboards, phones lifted into the air. Several foreign correspondents shouted over each other in different languages, broadcasting in real time. CNN cut its regularly scheduled program mid-sentence. "We have breaking news out of Washington," the anchor's voice stammered. "This is just in. Billionaire Warren Buffett has just been named in a federal criminal investigation. Live images coming from Capitol Hill now." The senators on the panel shifted uneasily. Some leaned back, visibly stunned, while others turned instinctively toward the press corps, already bracing for fallout. One aide accidentally dropped a stack of papers. No one picked them up. Even Buffett's legal team, once stoic and expressionless, seemed momentarily frozen in time, unsure if they were supposed to intervene or simply watch history carve itself into stone. And Buffett? He didn't rise. He didn't speak. He sat exactly where he had all morning. But this time, the weight pressing on him was no longer rhetorical. It was real, tangible, federal. His fingers, once gently folded, now gripped the edge of the table. His breathing was shallow. His eyes, those famously soft, calculating eyes, darted once to the exit and then back to the agent holding the paper. No words came. Because what could he say? That it wasn't true? That it was taken out of context? Context had just died on live television. And amid the firestorm, Jasmine didn't move. She remained in her seat, arms still crossed, her face unreadable. Not smug, not surprised, just still. As if she had seen this play out 1,000 times in her mind before it ever touched the morning air. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only a kind of resolute calm. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't reacting to the moment. She had created it. The noise in the room grew louder. Reporters were shouting over each other now. Some were already live, narrating what they were seeing. One camera zoomed in tight on Buffett's face, catching a bead of sweat rolling slowly down his temple. Another panned to Jasmine, calm, unmoved, her gaze fixed on a spot in the far distance, like she was watching not just this moment, but everyone that had led to it. No one spoke to her. No one had to. She had already said everything. A few seats down, a junior senator turned toward her, his lips parted as if to ask something, then thought better of it and looked away. Even the agents, after finishing the reading of the notice, seemed to hesitate slightly before continuing with their process. It was as if even they understood they had just walked into a political earthquake, one not triggered by paperwork or partisan games, but by a woman with facts, a microphone, and unshakable moral clarity. And in the center of that quake, Warren Buffett sat as still as a monument and just as silent. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't protest. And for the first time in decades, he didn't control the room. The billionaire who once said he'd rather explain his ethics than hide behind them now had neither option left. He was no longer the most powerful man in the room. He was a man under investigation. Behind him, a chorus of phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. Buffett named in DOJ probe. Federal agents crash Capitol hearing. Silence is no longer a strategy. Hashtags began trending before the door even closed behind the agents. Buffett fall. Silence on trial. Jasmine Crockett. And still she didn't move. Jasmine sat like stone. Eyes forward, spine straight, arms crossed in quiet command. Not in celebration, but in certainty. She didn't need to smirk or speak. She didn't need to stand and declare victory. She understood something few people ever do. When you stand on the side of truth long enough, power eventually walks into its own trap. She had not destroyed Buffett. He had done that himself. All she had done was turn on the lights. And as the hearing spiraled into headlines and legacy cracked under the weight of accountability, Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. A woman who had once been told she was too blunt, too loud, too ambitious, now sat as the quietest force in the room, because she didn't need noise. She had history, and in that moment, history was listening. The fallout was instant, but the aftershocks came slower, heavier. In the week following the hearing, the country shifted. Not with riots, not with protests, but with the kind of collective pause that happens when a myth finally breaks. Newsrooms re-aired Jasmine Crockett's questioning on loop. Editorials debated legacy versus accountability. Old interviews with Warren Buffett were dissected frame by frame. Universities, law schools, and civic panels convened emergency forums asking the question, how long can goodness be assumed if no one dares to test it? Buffett didn't appear on camera, not once. His legal team remained tight-lipped. Statements were delayed. No damage control op-ed appeared in the Wall Street Journal. No friendly editorials surfaced from longtime allies. The public wasn't waiting for denial. They were watching for admission. And it came, quietly, unexpectedly, and entirely in his own hand. Exactly 1 week after the hearing, a single-page letter was released to the public. It was written on pale cream stationery, with a signature that needed no introduction. The envelope was addressed not to a committee or an office, but directly to her, Representative Jasmine Crockett. The letter was dated, signed, and published without preamble. No statement from lawyers, no additional context, just a single paragraph. And that was all it needed. You didn't just question me. You named the very thing I had spent a lifetime learning how to live with: silence. The ink had barely dried before every news outlet in the country reported on it. Some called it a confession. Others called it reflection. A few tried to spin it as grace. But for those who had heard Buffett's voice on that recording, those who had watched his silence stretch minute by minute in front of the world, there was no poetry in it. It wasn't remorse, it was realization. And Jasmine Crockett did not reply. She didn't acknowledge the letter on social media. She didn't issue a press statement. She didn't frame it or parade it. She let it speak for what it was, and more importantly, for what it wasn't. Because silence, when exposed, does not deserve applause for its unraveling. Instead, she let her next move speak for her. 3 days later, Jasmine took the stage at a civic justice conference in Dallas, Texas. It wasn't held at a university or a grand auditorium. It was a modest community center, fluorescent lighting, folding chairs, a standing mic. But the room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Law students, educators, young activists, and senior citizens all leaned forward as she stepped to the podium. She wore no blazer, no congressional pin, just a plain black dress, sleeves rolled slightly past the elbow, and a single silver bracelet on her right wrist. She didn't read from a script. She didn't rehearse a narrative. What she delivered instead was a moment, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but commands it. Her voice was calm, her pacing deliberate. She wasn't there to repeat headlines. She was there to cut through them. And then, just minutes in, came the line that froze the room. I didn't come here to be apologized to. I came to dismantle the idea that power can ever be too old to be questioned. The room didn't explode. It absorbed, like her words had found a place to land inside everyone present. There was no applause break, no standing ovation, because what she said didn't seek praise. It sought truth, and it got it. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just confronting Warren Buffett anymore. She was confronting a nation's habit of forgiving comfort while punishing disruption. A country that had too often treated wealth as evidence of wisdom and treated silence as a virtue rather than a veil. She spoke of the power structures that had never been designed to hear voices like hers. She spoke of the scrutiny placed on the loud, while the quiet carved the laws behind closed doors. She reminded them that morality isn't measured by donations or dinners. It's measured by what we choose to stay silent about when we know we can speak. The question, she said, isn't how many hospitals you fund. The question is whether you ever asked how they got sick in the first place. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man behind her closed his eyes. Somewhere in the back, a teenager took out her phone, not to record a moment, but to write something down. Jasmine finished the speech without flourish. She didn't linger on the stage. She stepped down the same way she had walked up, steady, focused, still wrapped in the gravity of the work ahead. Not a warrior basking in victory, a builder laying bricks after the explosion. Outside, the media had gathered again. Dozens of reporters waited at the edge of the sidewalk. They wanted a quote about the letter. They wanted her response, but she passed them without a word. A quiet nod, a small wave. No need to relitigate the moment that had already passed, because she had made it clear. She wasn't here for closure. She was here for consequence. And somewhere behind the walls of a quiet estate, in the silence of a once untouchable office, Warren Buffett, for the first time in his public life, had been forced to admit what Jasmine Crockett had known all along. It was never about breaking the law. It was about never being asked to answer to something higher than it. And now someone finally had. That's why she didn't need to reply. The country already had. But the silence didn't last long. If Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Warren Buffett was the match, what followed was the explosion. Loud, systemic, and impossible to contain. Because when the cameras turned off, when the hearings adjourned and the headlines began to fade, Jasmine didn't retreat. She didn't tour the networks. She didn't write a memoir or launch a re-election ad. She did something rarer. She went back to work. And just 14 days after that seismic hearing, a new bill appeared on the floor of Congress. One that carried the fire of her voice, the weight of her evidence, and the fury of every American who had been taxed for breathing while billionaires rewrote the air. Its name was simple, but its implications were nuclear. The Fair Share Act. The bill was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Precise, deliberate, and devastatingly direct. At its core were two sweeping provisions. First, a permanent annual wealth tax on individuals whose net worth exceeded $100 million. Not income, not capital gains, assets, real estate, stock holdings, offshore accounts, undisclosed trusts. Every corner of generational wealth, measured, audited, taxed. Second, a ban on consumer borrowing using untaxed capital assets as collateral. No more leveraging $500 million in stock options to take out a tax-free loan while working families paid 28% on their W-2s. No more private jets funded by unreported equity. No more buying power without public responsibility. Jasmine had seen the loophole. Now she was setting it on fire. The reaction was instant and explosive. Within 24 hours of the bill's filing, Wall Street lit up red. CNBC anchors traded smirks for sweat. Financial analysts called it reckless, punitive, socialist, as if the idea of asking billionaires to contribute proportionally was an act of civil war. The Dow dropped 600 points before noon. Trading floors were flooded with sell-offs. Hedge funds issued statements warning of capital flight, as if rich people fleeing taxes wasn't proof of the law working, but of a system collapsing. Major lobbying groups launched immediate counteroffensives. Multi-page memos circulated across Capitol Hill. Senators received calls from billionaires who hadn't dialed their numbers in years. It's anti-growth, they said. It will hurt innovation. But Jasmine had heard it all before. She knew those phrases weren't arguments. They were alarms from a house finally catching fire. And while the market trembled, the country didn't. By the end of the week, a Pew Research poll showed something no one on Wall Street expected. 62% of Americans, Republicans and Democrats alike, supported the Fair Share Act. Not cautiously, not conditionally, overwhelmingly, because people didn't need graphs to understand unfairness. They had lived it. They had watched it in their pay stubs, in their hospital bills, in their second jobs, in their overdraft fees. And when Jasmine stood before that microphone, she hadn't explained policy. She had exposed injustice. Local newspapers ran editorials praising her clarity. College debate teams quoted her lines. Veterans groups in Pennsylvania and public school teachers in Wisconsin sent handwritten letters of support. They didn't use words like redistribution or economic revolution. They used words like finally, like enough. But inside Washington, the battle was just beginning. Jasmine was summoned to closed-door meetings with party leadership. They smiled politely. They called her ambitious, principled, courageous. Then they asked her to slow it down, to soften the language, to add a few sunset clauses or maybe raise the threshold. Just to give the bill a chance, they said. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she knew what that language meant. It meant compromise disguised as survival. It meant retreat, and she hadn't come this far to retreat. I won't apologize for proposing what the American people have already endorsed, she told them. If that makes me difficult, then maybe the system's been too easy. The room went quiet. Outside those walls, the lobbying blitz intensified. Attack ads aired in battleground states. Super PACs funded digital disinformation campaigns branding the Fair Share Act as an assault on freedom. Some even ran attack spots featuring grainy clips of Jasmine at the hearing, stripped of context, with dark music and twisted captions. They tried to reduce her to a soundbite, something to be feared, not followed. But it didn't work, because people didn't see a radical. They saw a woman who had stood alone, faced the most powerful man in the country, and told him the truth. They saw someone who wasn't just writing laws. They saw someone who understood why laws needed to be rewritten in the first place. As hearings began for the bill, opposition sharpened. Buffett's name was no longer spoken in admiration, but in whispers of strategy meetings. Lobbyists scrambled to calculate the cost of every clause. Yet Jasmine kept her posture. She attended every meeting. She answered every question. She faced every attempt to stall, delay, water down, or kill the bill with the same unwavering force she had shown that day on the Capitol floor. "They said I should negotiate with silence," she told the press. "I think silence has had enough airtime." By the third week, her co-sponsor list had doubled. Not because she begged, not because she traded favors, but because members of Congress, some reluctantly, others defiantly, realized they couldn't go home and explain why they refused to tax billionaires while voting to cut food programs for veterans and children. Jasmine didn't need to threaten them. The truth did it for her, and even as the markets bounced and the think tanks blustered, something else was happening, something more permanent. The narrative was changing. For the first time in a generation, wealth itself was being questioned not as a symbol of success, but as a source of obligation. Jasmine hadn't just proposed a tax. She had reframed the conversation around what it means to be American in an economy designed to excuse the few and exhaust the many. The Fair Share Act hadn't passed yet. The fight was still ahead. But something irreversible had already begun. A threshold had been crossed, not with rage, not with riots, but with a voice, a binder, in the unshakable clarity of justice delivered in broad daylight. And in that moment, as the hearings continued and the country held its breath, one truth became clear. This was no longer about Buffett. It was about every silence his world had protected. And Jasmine Crockett had just made it impossible to unhear. But even as the committee chambers cooled and the news cycle slowed, something else was happening. Quieter, but more permanent. Jasmine Crockett, once a name whispered with cautious respect on Capitol Hill, had become something more than a headline. She had become a spark, not just for policy, but for the reawakening of civic courage. What she had done in that hearing room, what she had dared to say without apology, could not be undone. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't posturing. It was a declaration that the old rules of immunity no longer applied. And it had landed not only in the record books, but in the bloodstream of a generation hungry for truth that didn't need translation. She wasn't crowned. She wasn't manufactured. She emerged, not through backdoor deals or cable contracts, but through a single, unbroken act of moral confrontation. She hadn't out-yelled her opponents. She had outstayed them. In a world addicted to noise, she chose clarity. In a chamber full of legacy, she chose honesty. Her rise wasn't powered by wealth or party. It was powered by the collective breath of people who had gone too long unheard. And the country noticed. It started subtly. Protest signs that once carried the names of martyrs began appearing with her quotes scrawled in bold marker. Morality isn't optional. Silence is a strategy, so is courage. College students turned her questioning of Buffett into study material. Civics teachers played the hearing for seniors during exam week. At first, some called it a media wave, but waves crash. This didn't. This spread. Because her words had come from lived truth, and people know when truth has roots. Across the country, the response was visceral. Mothers in Cleveland sent handwritten notes saying, "Thank you for speaking like you've been where we live." Veterans in Georgia wrote, "It's the first time I've seen a politician call out the real game and not blink." A retired steelworker in Pennsylvania started a podcast dedicated to exposing corporate lobbying, named simply Crockett's Ledger. She wasn't asking for devotion, but she had earned trust, and that was rare. And yet Jasmine didn't chase the attention. She returned every invitation to corporate-sponsored award galas with the same message: "I'm not done yet." She declined a book deal. She refused a primetime CNN town hall unless the topic was working-class tax burdens. She walked away from interviews that tried to paint her as the anti-billionaire. Because she wasn't against wealth. She was against unquestioned power, against the rot that happens when influence ages without ever being challenged. Even her enemies shifted. They no longer mocked her. They studied her. Lobbyists reworded their talking points, trying not to trigger her phrases. PR firms advised executives to preemptively disclose donations before hearings in case the Crockett effect kicks in. Congressional committees quietly asked her for input before inviting witnesses. She had not changed the system yet, but she had changed the rules of silence inside it. Meanwhile, her district in Texas, long overlooked, became a case study in modern civic organizing. Young voters registered in record numbers. Town halls packed to capacity without snacks or giveaways. Constituents who had never once spoken at a public meeting stepped up, not because they expected results, but because they had seen what one voice could do under oath. She didn't need to convince them to care. They had already seen that courage wasn't abstract. It had a face, a cadence, a presence that didn't blink when power tried to stare her down. But the transformation wasn't only grassroots, it was institutional. Academic panels invited her not as a footnote, but as keynote. Civil rights attorneys began citing her hearing as the modern pivot of financial justice narratives. Philanthropic organizations, once loyal to economic orthodoxy, were forced to reconsider how their own funding reinforced inequity. And on Wall Street, behind closed doors, CEOs began asking one another questions they hadn't in decades. What if we have to answer to someone who doesn't need our money? Still, Jasmine stayed grounded. She didn't rewrite her voice. She didn't hire a new comms team. She kept her small, overworked staff and her policy-heavy agenda. When told to polish her rhetoric for broader appeal, she replied, "People don't need me to sound more like Congress. Congress needs to sound more like them." She wasn't playing the game differently. She was refusing to play it at all. And yet somehow she was winning. News anchors who once brushed her off as fiery but fringe began using her name in sentences with historical weight. One even compared her to Barbara Jordan. Another called her the moral heir of Elizabeth Warren, with the cross-examination instinct of Thurgood Marshall. But she didn't quote those lines. When asked about them, she just shook her head. "I'm not anyone's heir," she said. "I'm the consequence." And that was the truth. Jasmine wasn't the next anything. She was the first of something else entirely. A public servant whose power came not from pedigree or press, but from a commitment to break the ritual of silence with precision and fire. In hearings, in speeches, in closed-door sessions, she spoke the way people wish they could when their rent is due and no one listens. In one particularly tense budget negotiation, when another representative implied her Fair Share Act was a dangerous shift in tone, she looked him in the eye and said, "If fairness is dangerous, you're defending the wrong system." He didn't interrupt her again. Over time, even foreign leaders began referencing her in parliamentary debates. In France, a socialist senator quoted her when challenging a fossil fuel executive. In India, a student activist held up a placard with her face beside the phrase, "Courage has no market value." She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but the world needed one, not of perfection, but of resistance made real. And through it all, Jasmine carried the same fire she had brought into that hearing room, the same calm refusal to look away, the same moral exactness that had once shocked the country but now reframed it. She had proven that change doesn't begin when the majority agrees. It begins when one voice refuses to ask permission to speak the truth. That was her legacy, not legislation alone, not media praise, but a new blueprint of what it looks like to face a wall of power and keep speaking until the wall cracks. She hadn't shouted it down. She hadn't stormed it. She had asked it a question it couldn't answer, then asked again, then refused to accept silence as the end of the conversation. And for a nation starved of honesty and tired of spectacle, that was everything. And even as Jasmine's words echoed through legislative halls and city streets, the old order began to respond, not with press releases or deflections, but with surrender. Days after the Fair Share Act cleared its first committee hurdle, Warren Buffett appeared in a brief video message. No backdrop, no corporate banner, just a white wall and the faint hum of a room too quiet. The man who once stood at the summit of American capitalism now sat alone in front of a camera, his voice steady but smaller. In a measured tone, he announced his resignation from all remaining corporate boards, including Berkshire Hathaway. More startling than that, he declared his intention to dissolve personal control over his wealth, transferring it to a citizen-led, rotating philanthropic trust overseen not by billionaires, but by elected community representatives from across the country. There was no applause, no tears, just the sound of something ending, and beneath it, perhaps, the faint echo of something finally beginning. He didn't mention Jasmine by name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who had brought the truth to the surface and what it cost her to do it. The media tried to spin it as a legacy pivot. A graceful retirement, one headline read. The Oracle bows out with honor, claimed another. But the public wasn't fooled. This wasn't grace. It was reckoning. Late, necessary, and unavoidable. Buffett hadn't given up control. He had lost it. And in doing so, he became the first in a line of names now forced to answer the question Jasmine Crockett had carved into the bones of the system itself. What did you do with your power while you had it? Not long after, an invitation arrived. Gilded Edges, a personal letter from the director of the World Economic Forum. Jasmine was asked to headline the Davos summit. Front stage, prime hour, global coverage. They wanted her to speak about justice, markets, and moral courage. They promised a standing ovation, but she declined. No press statement, no tweet, just a simple message. Not all stages are built for truth. Instead, that same week, she boarded a late-night flight back to Texas and drove 2 hours into the hill country. No motorcade, no staff. She arrived at a small community college on the outskirts of San Antonio. Student body under 2,000, parking lot half empty. The event wasn't nationally televised. There were no glowing panels or curated lighting, just a folding chair, a podium, and a single microphone that crackled when turned on. The room filled slowly. Students came in pairs, professors stood against the walls, and a few local farmers who'd heard about it on a Spanish-language radio station showed up and sat in the back. Jasmine stepped up to the podium wearing a plain blue blouse, no notes in hand. She didn't wait for silence. She brought it with her. She looked across the small crowd, not for admiration, not for approval, but for something simpler, connection. And then, in a voice steady as the hearing that had changed a country, she gave her final line. Not scripted, not branded, just raw and true. I don't believe in legends. I believe in truth, even when it comes from someone who's been told they're too young, too loud, and too dark to be heard. No one clapped at first. They didn't know if they were supposed to, but slowly, hands came together. Then more. Then all. Not in thunder, but in reverence. Because they weren't just applauding her. They were welcoming the space she had opened. For all of them. And in that quiet, flickering auditorium, far from wealth, far from power, far from the cameras, Jasmine Crockett didn't rise into myth. She remained human, and that was enough to move history. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.